Hello everybody, I'm back again, and this time I'm operating in PowerPoint mode, trying to be all educational. I thought I'd talk a bit about 5G. You can't have failed to notice that over the last year or two, with the rollout of 5G approaching, there have been lots of news articles and protests and things like that by people questioning the safety of the technology and, in general, implying that it's not safe. This little video is me trying to dispel some of those rumours and explain why 5G is actually safe and is actually safer than the technologies that have gone before it. To start off with, I'm going to take you on a little bit of a history lesson through mobile phone technology, going back to the 80s and the first generation of commercial mobile phones. So, back then, 1G, we had AMPS or TACS, the Advanced Mobile Phone System in the States, known as Total Access Communication System in Europe. Operated on frequencies from 890 MHz to 950 MHz, and the handset power was up to 10 watts, and the base station transmitter tower was up to 100 watts, though in reality they used a lot less than that because mobile phones themselves and the base stations will use as little power as they can at a particular moment in time. So they're constantly upping and downing the power output to get the best signal. That helps them save battery life and reduce power consumption. There was no data on 1G, and it was analog voice, and there was no security, as certain members of the royalty discovered to their cost. Anyways, let's move on to 2G. GSM, Global Specification for Mobile Communications. Yeah, there was a different system in America and Japan, but they shared the same basic technology. I'm just using GSM because I'm based in Europe. The frequencies it used were 876 to 915 MHz and 1710 MHz to 1784 MHz. But in theory, there were a number of ranges in between 380 MHz and 1900 MHz. But those are the two that were used in Europe. I also believe for a short while 1900 was used in the US as well by T-Mobile, although I'm not 100% certain on that. Handset transmission power was limited to 2 watts, and for some odd reason the transmitter power was up to 320, which really doesn't make any sense, but I read the specification document and that's what it said. So, okay, as you do. Data speed was originally 9.8 kilobits per second, which is painfully slow. Although it was launched before the internet was a thing. They added on various features such as GPRS and Edge, which took the speed up to a potential 240 kilobits per second. And this concept of adding enhancements and upgrades to the current generation seems to be a feature of all generations since then. Another interesting thing about GSM is it was totally digital, and it was the first generation to use time division multiple access to allow multiple calls to exist on one frequency. 3G, the Universal Mobile Telecommunication Service or System. Look at the frequencies. It goes from 900 to 2100. Generally, that was broken up into chunks because it was sharing that area with lots of other radio services. So what frequency you operated on between those two outliers depended on what country you're in and what network you're in. So you didn't use the whole space. You didn't have access to all those frequencies. You just had access to maybe a 20 or 30 megahertz space, which was allocated probably to one or two mobile operators in a specific country. Transmitter base station power was 5 watts, but it was allowed to go higher in rural or areas where they wanted to stretch out the signal. And the handset could only transmit at 398 milliwatts. So that's very, very weak. Data speed was 21.5 megabits per second once all the various enhancements were added, although when it launched back in 2002-2003 it was only limited to 500 kilobits per second. So you see, they're always doing these enhancements to try and push the technology of the generation forward. And 3G was like the first mobile standard that was designed with data speed in mind. 1G and 2G were all about voice. 4G, long-term evolution. It was an evolution of the 3G technology. It wasn't a rewrite or anything. It was just taking that technology a bit further. The frequencies it could go on were from 900 megahertz to 5200 megahertz, although in practice it operated between 900 and 2600 megahertz depending on where you are in the network. Speed potentially 300 megabits per second, but then again, in reality, you'd never get anywhere near that. And it was also interesting in that it dropped circuits for calls. Now, a circuit is in simple terms a certain amount of the bandwidth available to you. For example, with 3G, it'd be a certain amount of digital bandwidth set aside that your voice or audio would go down. Now, of course, you can reduce the amount of data you need if you're not speaking or the audio you're transmitting doesn't require as much space. But with a circuit, you always have the same amount of space dedicated to you. VoIP is different. It just treats it like a data packet. So if the audio at a particular moment in time you're speaking can be pressed down further, it will be, and it won't take up any space it doesn't need to. So that's what LTE was. And now we're coming on to 5G, new radio as they call it. I didn't have a picture of a typical phone, so I just put in a picture of a cat that looks like it's judging you. Now you look at the frequencies. Instead of maxing out at 5200, it maxes out at 39 gigahertz, way up. No, it's like previous generations, the top frequency increased bit by bit, but this is like gone way above. Transmitter power is limited to 20 watts, but in reality it'd be a lot less, particularly in urban areas. And handset transmitter power is 400 milliwatts. Potentially there is a 1 gigabit per second speed, but you'd only get that when your phone is operating on the top frequencies. And I'll come to that in a minute. So that was a quick history lesson. The thing I want you to take away from that was that as each generation progressed onto the next, the upper frequency you could use went higher and higher. So let's get back to 5G. What do they want from it? Well, more speed, obviously. Less latency. That's the time it takes for the signal to get from your phone to the base station and vice versa. They want to use it for mission critical applications, and this is an add-on feature that your network would have to choose, but there's various standards they adhere to, and once they've done this, they can guarantee that the signal will be available over a particular area at all times. Another thing 5G offers is more users, but that's kind of as a side effect of the technology they use, and I'll come to that as well later. MIMO, multiple input, multiple output, and beamforming are two related technologies. They're not technically part of 5G, but they're sort of being rolled out for the first time with 5G en masse. MIMO and beamforming is basically the antenna site has an array of antennas, lots of little miniature antennas pointing in all directions, each one having their own transmitting circuitry. The idea being that they can analyze the signals going out to phones and work out which side of the antenna the phone is on, and then concentrate all the energy for that particular call out of that side of the antenna. And also they can have multiple connections to the phone at once, so they can send data in parallel over multiple antennas, thus potentially speeding up data transfer. And the big thing they're pushing for 5G, which I don't actually think is all that big, I think it's one of those things that they're bigging up and it's going to turn out not to be that popular at all, is massive machine type communications or Internet of Things. So they want little devices like your fridges is the one everyone thinks of, but like there's clothing with microchips built in that can communicate with the internet, and shoes that can communicate with the internet, and also cars, and you name it. And for that it's kind of a case of having a signal that can be used at low power and won't consume as adaptable, so that the devices that pick it up don't have to do too much computational power to make use of it. So let's look at the problems with 5G. Right. More bandwidth requires more radio spectrum. So what you do to get that spectrum is you generally move up higher in the frequency band. And as you can see with 5G, they've gone way up into the millimeter wave band. They've shot through the roof entirely. You're moving into space that's unoccupied, basically. And that gives you more space to send out more signals. More wider signals that can carry more data. But the problem is, for a given level of power, moving into a higher frequency means the signal loses its strength faster. So sending out 1 watt of power at 100 megahertz, the signal might go 50 meters before losing half its energy. Send out that another signal, send out a signal at 1 gigahertz with the same level of power, it might lose half its strength within a matter of centimeters. So you'd think the obvious solution is just to increase the power, but then you run into a problem with this whole Internet of Things idea they've had, where they want small devices, and the problem there is if they're too close to a transmitter, they may get overloaded because it's small technology and small circuits can't handle powerful signals. So you think, well, fit something called an attenuator, and that basically reduces the intensity of a electrical signal, or in this case a radio signal, by effectively dissipating part of it as heat. Manufacturers don't want to do that. It complicates their circuits. It gives them a heat problem they don't want to deal with. They don't want attenuation, full stop. They don't want attenuation devices in their products, full stop. So how do you basically provide a mobile phone service that works for small devices and big devices and everything in between? Well, you reduce the power of the base station and have more base stations. Simple. So that means you can have your high frequency signals. You know they're not going to travel very far. So what you do is you just put in more base stations to fill in the gaps. The byproduct of that is you also get more users, because each base station can now, instead of one base station covering, say, 200 square meters, one base station may only now cover as little as 50 square meters. So that means you've four base stations in the space of what used to be one, but it also means you get 4 times as many users. And they've also tweaked the algorithms they use for encapsulating the data to also allow more users, plus the fact they're operating in an area of the radio spectrum where they've got more frequencies available to them. So that's why they get more users available, more signals available for more users. Now, of course, you only get those high speeds when you're close to a transmitter, and in many cases, to get millimeter wave signals, the signals that carry really high speed data, you're going to be less than maybe 100 meters at a push, maybe 200. Those signals don't go very far before they lose their energy. So if you're further away from the transmitter, there's going to be backup 4G. So that's what's going to move. So effectively, the service is designed to sort of carry a parallel 4G signal. It's not really 4G, but it's a fallback. So it will work at distance. It's just you won't be getting the super high speeds that you're getting with 5G. But the thing is, the lower power that's going to be used with 5G means that in itself implies it's a much safer service than 4G, 3G, and 2G, which generally operated at a much higher power, because your phone is going to be transmitting at milliwatts, and chances are the base stations are going to be operating at 2 or 3 watts at a time. So that in itself should imply the service is safe. But there's more. This is a very crude rendition of a bit of the electromagnetic spectrum, specifically the radio bit. You may notice that from AM radio, 1 megahertz, I know it starts lower than that. Long wave radio is down at 198 kilohertz. But forgive me for that. But this is more just a general diagram. But from there, 1 megahertz up to 300 megahertz, you're in VHF, UHF territory and shortwave territory. And HF, VHF, and UHF territory, those radio signals just pass through you, straight through you. When you get above 300, you're getting into the microwave territory, and above that, millimeter wave. I know I've got radar down, and that's not really a classification, it's just an application, but those signals then start to struggle to penetrate matter, because the higher the frequency, the harder the more it struggles to penetrate matter. In this case, your skin and your flesh. The millimeter wave signals, which are way up at 39 gigahertz, they'll penetrate your clothes, but they will not penetrate your skin. There's actually a real world application of this in airports where they've got millimeter wave scanners at security to look under your clothes and see if you're hiding anything, which whether they work or not, I don't know, but they're in use. Now, of course, all radio signals, such as on these, these are known, can carry danger. If you stand near a transmitter that's pumping out very high power transmissions, and by this I'm talking like several hundred watts, there is a risk of a heating effect, and that can we utilize that for microwave ovens, for example. But then microwave ovens work at several hundred watts using a very focused beam, and all they do is they actually cause water molecules to spin and vibrate and give off heat. It's a bit more complicated than that, but that's how microwaves work. But at the signal strengths and intensities that these services operate at, there is literally no risk to your body. The signal can't penetrate your body. In actual fact, older services are more likely to have a signal that goes deeper into your flesh than these. So millimeter wave, the frequencies that will give us 5G speeds, the signals just will not penetrate our skin. So when people say it's dangerous and it's going to do things to your brain, don't listen to them. The signal can't get through your skin. So is 5G safe? Yes, it is. But it does have other problems. And before I move on, I just want to say a large part of the issue with 5G and why people are afraid of it is actually down to a report published by a guy called Bill Curry in 2000. There was a schools district in the States, can't remember the name, but they basically said to him, would you be willing to do some research into mobile phone use? Because we're kind of concerned all the students are getting mobile phones. And this would have been around the time of 2G. 3G didn't come out until 2002, 2003. And he came back and he said, oh, this is terrible. It's all this electromagnetic radiation is building up in your brain and it's doing damage, and I think it's terrible. But then the school took it serious, but then all his colleagues and people in the scientific community were like, hold on a second, no, this isn't right. You may be a physicist, but you've got the details wrong here. These radio signals will not penetrate that deeply into skin. No, so you got it wrong. And he didn't take this into account. His findings have not been reproduced by any other credible scientist or study, but yet, such is the way these things work, people took his results and ran with them. And it's just like the MMR vaccine causing autism scare. Andrew Wakefield, one doctor, one researcher, wrote a paper saying this is what will happen, despite all his colleagues and peers saying this is nonsense. It caused a movement of people who just were like, yeah, he knows what he's talking about and we're going to believe him. You know, it's kind of sad that this happens, but there you go. Anyway, so let's move on to the real problems with 5G, and they're not health related. The first thing is, the way data is encapsulated in a mobile phone signal is using a fancy form of FM, coded orthogonal frequency divisional multiplexing or some other kind like that. In simple terms, a frequency modulation signal works by having the receiver tune into a central frequency and monitor the signal coming in. That signal will jump about either side of that central frequency, and as the way it moves around up or down from that frequency is how you encode the data, and then the fancy encapsulation algorithm looks at that and then turns that into a bit stream. So you have two problems there. Is, you increase the bandwidth, you need better electronics to handle wider bandwidth signals, and secondly, as the frequency jumps around more, the circuits have to operate a bit faster, and then on top of that, as the mathematics of the algorithm improve, you need a better processor to decode the raw data and turn it into a bit stream. So more bandwidth does give you more data, and more sophisticated forms of FM encapsulation also help to give you more data, but higher frequencies and faster encapsulation algorithms mean you need faster processors, better electronics, and that is going to massively increase battery drain. And I kind of think that the manufacturers of remote handsets have been neglecting battery technology the last few years. They've been focused more on bells and whistles and trying to reduce power consumption using fancy techniques that shut down the parts of the processors when they're not in use. The reality is, I do think they need to look at battery technology a bit more. As regards the base stations, the use of multiple input and multiple output beamforming has the effect of increasing power consumption on the base station by 3 to 4 times. That's crazy when you think about it. Manufacturers and networks are aware of this and they're trying to deal with this, but there's no easy fix. If they want those benefits for the consumer, they're going to have to swallow the increased running costs. And you know what that means? It's going to be passed on to us. And here, of course, using the lower power signals to get as a way to get those higher data speeds, and increasing the number of base stations. Again, more cost for us. We're going to pay for that. I don't know if you've noticed recently, the last few years, there's been a push for mobile phone companies that were independent to sort of be bought over or merge or take over to old traditional landline companies, which is kind of a reversal of what happened in the early 2000s when the landline companies, which owned mobile phone companies, were selling them off. And the reason for this is all those extra base stations need more physical infrastructure. They need to be able to access fiber lines or Ethernet lines or some way of getting the data from the base stations that are going to be popping up everywhere back into the telephone and exchanges and data centers. And landline companies already have that. They've got the holes and pipes in the ground, so the base stations can be easily set up near these locations. So that's a way of trying to cut costs. But for the networks that don't have access to that, there's going to be costs, and they're going to be passed on to us. Also, remember I was saying that 5G signals don't penetrate water and don't penetrate your skin. It also means they don't penetrate walls of houses very well. So don't count on getting 5G speeds indoors. So unless you use a femtocell or something like that, and that's basically a device you can plug into your broadband and it'll generate a mobile signal within your home, or you can attach an antenna to the outside of your house and it'll relay the 5G signal inside. But yeah, 5G signals will not work inside homes without special equipment. So you'll get the slower 4G equivalent speeds, but you won't be getting the 5G speeds. And looking at security as a problem, well, there is, because of all these features that they're adding into 5G, the Internet of Things features, the reliability service, and various other features, you're increasing the attack surface for hackers, or crackers, call them what you will. Now there's been questions raised about the authentication algorithms that are used to authenticate phones to the network and vice versa. I'm not too concerned about that because that's sort of stuff that can be updated by firmware. I would be more concerned about all the IoT items which are going to be appearing, if they appear. IoT, Internet of Things manufacturers have got a terrible reputation for safety. They really, really don't care about it. It's always an afterthought. And what's going to happen is if we have an explosion in the number of Internet of Things devices being used with 5G, the chances are they're going to be switched on and forgotten about, and that's going to become a security risk. Just look at how many wireless cameras and IP cameras are left wide open because the manufacturers didn't really care about security. So, it's something we need to consider as a particular issue. And I suppose the other thing is, certainly in Ireland, and I've heard 5G being used as an answer to rural speed issues. Like if you live out in the countryside, your ADSL speed is going to be terrible, less than 1 megabit per second, and you're lucky to get a 3G or 4G signal. Even if you do, you're at the fringe of coverage, so your speed's not that great. So people say, 5G will sort that out, but then it doesn't work over long distances. If you don't over long distances, you kind of revert to the sort of 4G compatible speeds. But yeah, 5G is being promoted as an answer to everyone's internet woes, and it isn't really. It's actually quite limited. There's going to be digital have-nots and digital haves with 5G, where if you live in urban areas where it's easy to install all these new base stations, you're going to get blistering speeds. But if you live more than a few hundred meters away from an urban area, your speeds are going to just drop off. And there's not going to be any financial incentive for the networks to install more base stations in those areas. Simple as that. So there you go. That's the end of this. 5G safe, but it does have problems which we're kind of overlooking and we should be looking at. And with that, I will finish. Cheers. Take care. Bye.